Tasha Brandon, the Program Manager and Focal Point at Seattle City of Literature. Thank you so much for joining us. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. Here in Seattle, we're on the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders past, present, and future, and thank them for their stewardship of the land. I'd also like to encourage you to find resources about colonization and its impact on Native peoples and their lands at your local library. Welcome to this program with Seattle civic poet Dujie Tahat and Kurdish poet Zamwa Mohommed, presented by Seattle City of Literature and Slemani UNESCO City of Literature, and supported by Seattle's Office of Arts and Culture. When Seattle was designated a UNESCO City of Literature back in 2017, we joined a global network of creative cities. There are currently 63 cities of literature around the world, and we're delighted to partner with Slemani, Iraq to bring you this program. Both Slemani and Seattle have amazing poets, and we're excited to highlight their work. We'll enjoy a conversation with Seattle civic poet Dujie Tahat and Kurdish poet, translator, critic, and journalist Zamwa Mohommed. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Tasha.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Zamwa. Kind of like I was saying before we started, my hope for the conversation is largely to read some poems together and sort of like talk about the relationship of poetry and civic life or public life in Slemani, and exchange some ideas about poetry and civic life across the cities of literature. I'm wondering if maybe you could start. You sent over a few poems. If you could start by reading the Borges, The Heart of Poetry.
Sure, why not? The Art of Poetry. To gaze at a river made of time and water, and remember time is another river. To know we stray like a river, and our faces vanish like water. To feel that waking is another dream, that dreams of not dreaming, and that the death we fear in our bones is the death that every night we call a dream. To see in every day and year a symbol of all the days of man and his years, and convert the outrage of the years into a music, a sound, and a symbol. To see in death a dream, in the sunset a golden sadness, such is poetry, humble and immortal, poetry, returning like dawn on the sunset. Sometimes at evening there is a face that sees us from the deeps of the mirror. Art must be that sort of mirror, disclosing to each of us his face. They say Ulysses, wearied of wonders, wept with love on seeing Ithaca. Humble and green, art is that Ithaca, a green eternity, not wonders. Art is endless like a river flowing, passing yet remaining, a mirror to the same in constant Heraclius, who is the same and yet another, like the river flowing. Of course, I'm not really great in reading poetry.
That's perfect.
And when friends, even readers, ask me to read a poem of mine. By the way, I've never read a poem of mine in public or events, because I always say I like to write them, not to read them out loud.
Yeah. That's so funny. I might ask you to read one of your poems then later, just to. But yeah, let's start with Borges. Talk to me about why this poem, what your relationship is to the poem, what about it you love.
Okay. So, by the way, this poem I remember I translated it very early when I started into Kurdish, and in literature, like in general, what I really like is if we can call it, the self-consciousness of the text itself or of the poem itself. I like literature and especially poetry as a text to be really self-conscious about what gives to the reader, what relationship it has to between other texts, what relationship the text has to interpretation, or the ones who interpret it. And I think this poem, in that regard, it has a really high level of self-consciousness and a really high level of consciousness toward poetry, towards defining poetry, and like let's say redefining or kind of deconstructing poetry as well. So sometimes I say that I like what we call like philosophical literature, or a literature that it's not only sentimental, or not only feelings, not only experiences, but it has discourses as well. It discusses. So that's the main point that I like about this poem.
Yeah, it's a very thinky poem, right? It's thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
That third stanza, I think when I hear you say self-consciousness, I think about this third stanza: to see in every day and year a symbol of all the days of man, and convert the outrage of the years into a music, a sound, and a symbol. There's this kind of like circular way of taking something in and then producing an artificial, like, you know, the poem is like so highly constructed, even just in the like really tightly structured 4-line stanzas. But it's still like, you know, I think a lot about a conversation I had many years ago with a poet from around here, Rick Barrett, who said something about like artifice is not the antithesis of truth. You know, I think there's like in poetry, at least certainly in like American sort of post-confessional poetry, I think there's a impulse towards like authenticity as like a sort of like gritty, unrefined kind of thing. And so I love the way that even in that stanza alone, it actually is something about the reproduction of it, the actual production of the thought, of the poem, of the material, is actually essential to capturing that sort of like initial sort of truth. And that feels related to self-consciousness that you're talking about.
Yeah, it contains, he has a really good book, This Craft of Verse, by the way. And you feel the same worldview that he discusses in that book, really kind of between the lines here. So yeah, as you said, it's really a thinky poem.
Yeah. You mentioned that you translated this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you were translating it from English, is that right?
Yes.
Did you have any, so obviously this was originally written. Did you have, I guess I'm curious what the linguistic challenges you had translating from English to Kurdish.
Yeah.
With the understanding.
In terms, yeah, I see. In terms of like, because here in Iraq, we don't have translators we have some, but not many that have access to or can translate from, let's say, Spanish or from all the languages of Latin America, let's say. So the alternative sometimes is like to translate from one language and compare that translation into a translation that was done into another language. For example, I have this text in English, which is translated from the original, and I have another text from Arabic, which again translated from the original. So we compared those two translations. And best, or the closest I could get to the original was through that, at that time, let's say.
Yeah.
Through comparing the English text and the Arabic text.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're like, it's not even I think translation is often considered a one-to-one, but you're translating in triangulation almost.
It's in some sense, it's an interpretation of an interpretation.
Right, yeah. Well, so, I mean, having the English version.
But yeah, I liked the poem, and that was the closest I could get to the original, let's say. language barrier and so on.
Of course. Do you remember like a specific, and this is, you know, pretty in the weeds, but is there like a specific phrase or like a syntactical construct or like an image that was like really hard to figure out?
At that time?
Or even when that's back to you that maybe surprised interpretation?
Well, I have to think about that.
For sure.
Because it was like almost 7 years ago, 6 years ago, something like that. But no, as I remember it, itself, again, when I read it now, it's like the language is some kind of smoothly flowing. It's not, and the meaning is the so many meanings, but the writing itself, it's really smooth and it flows really. You can read it really easily and translate it really easily in terms of words. But you know that the real meaning is behind the words, let's say. So
yeah,
in terms of plain text, it's easy to translate, I'd say. But you have to be careful about what's behind, let's say, how someone will interpret it in the second language. And the challenge wasn't to take this from English or Arabic and put it in Kurdish, but the challenge was to be conscious about how the readers of Kurdish will read it and understand it. You kind of, in translation, sometimes you have to guide the reader into the interpretation or the meaning that sometimes you favor or sometimes it's the correct one.
Right. Yeah.
So the challenge was there actually to control and mold the Kurdish, if that makes sense, to make it contain that meaning that you find in the English and Arabic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe is there any other things about the poem you want to talk about, or you want to highlight, or we can pivot into some of my other questions for you?
Not much on my side, actually. We can move on.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious then, I guess, you know, to start with, because, you know, we are in different places on the planet with very different cultural contexts for our individual relationships to poetry, our city's relationships to poetry. So I'm kind of curious, you know, this is a really big, broad question, but to start with, putting a stake in the ground a little bit, like what as you see it, the sort of cultural relevance of poetry and Slemani in Iraq for the Kurdish people, kind of right?
Honestly, it depends on, if you ask me what's the relationship of the Kurds or a Kurdish reader or writer to poetry, it really depends on the, let's say the different eras, because originally our only way of writing and expressing ourselves was poetry. For example, the oldest text that we can find in what we call Central Kurdish, let's say our dialects of Kurdish, is in poetry. Mm-hmm. So it's the first form of expressive writing historically. So it's basically the start of everything in terms of language for us. And in another era, when we were facing Saddam Hussein and the threat of you weren't allowed to even speak in Kurdish at those times in some areas. And at those times, writing in Kurdish, and again, especially poetry, was a kind of a revolt or a revolution against inside language, of course, and for the sake of language, for the sake of using language. So, and After that, in the more modern times, and let's say in these days, it's a bit more individualized, and you can have or build your own relationship to poetry, to redefine it, to deconstruct it, to call it what you want to call it, let's say. Not a way of revolution, not an origin, not sometimes a passion, sometimes a way to think, to breathe, and so on. So it really depends on the time that we speak about for Kurds, because it changed so much, and the role and the definition of poetry and even the form it changed so much throughout the years.
Yeah. Could you tell me about the form? And that makes total sense. Obviously, that poetry is sort of shaped by the like cultural, political context. I'm curious for you, when you say the form has also sort of changed, can you tell me a little bit about that as well? Like what shapes it? How has it changed?
Yeah, when it started back in the days, we have the times of Nali and Mahwi, and we call them the classical poets. It was written on rhythm and rhymes, and much is the same for any other country. We were, I don't know if you are acquainted or aware of the Aruz system. They were writing on the Aruzi system back in the days, and after that, let's say compared to the modern times, we just have a more free verse style, for example. So in terms of form, and in terms of the metaphors, in terms of the poetic imagery, it really changed, because back then it was a bit religious, not in terms of ideology, but in terms of visualization, let's say. The ghazal and so on. But today it's much more, let's say, naturalized from those types of imagery, let's say.
Yeah. That makes sense. I think you're correct. I think in naming there's a cultural analog sort of across languages too. The sort of, because Aruz, just to clarify, right, is like the just very metered, structured poetry. And I think even in the English language tradition, there's poetry.
Yeah, even in the Middle East, there's this it's becoming a category, prose verse. Right. Let's say a verse in prose or a prose in verse, vice versa. So yeah, we are kind of going into that direction lately. I mean, the past 30 to 40 years.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that makes a ton of sense. I think, they're similarly, I think, prose. I just saw a prose poem by an acquaintance published earlier today. And similarly, I think a lot about the way that our phones also change our relationship to language and form. And that feels also like prose blocks on phones make a lot of sense relative to having paper and a pen, or being able to make other decisions.
Yeah, and honestly, controlling the meters, especially the Aruzi meters, even learning it is not for everyone. And it's not really easy to handle, let's say. It's not even easy to learn, especially the Aruzi metrics. I remember in the past, I tried to write in it. I wrote a few poems, but you feel very, very, very limited.
Yeah.
And, for example, all your life you may be able to publish one booklet, let's say, and it's I don't think it's necessary anymore.
Yeah.
And it can have its purposes. I'm working on new project. It's a new poem, a longer poem, let's say. Some part of it will be on the Aruzi metric intentionally, but in general, for all poetry to be on that metric, I don't think that will work. That would work.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the world has like sort of moved past that, right? If like the language is to, or if the point of the poem is to sort of enliven our relationship to language, you know, and we look at metric as like kind of a stagnant thing. You know,
honestly, metric is a relation to sound, not to language.
No, that's an excellent point. I'm curious, actually, in the way that you've broken it down a little bit. You know, let's say, obviously, it's like much more nuanced and complex than this. But let's say there's the classical, in the history of Kurdish poetry, there's classical poetry. There's sort of like poetry as a revolutionary act in Saddam's Iraq. Then there is sort of like this post that, where you know, poetry is much more wider.
There's so much between those three, let's say.
Obviously, very much so. This is like the most reductive.
For the sake of the conversation, we have to.
Exactly. I'm curious, like, thinking about maybe this like long poem that you're working on, thinking about like your own poetics. It sounds like you're starting to, or that you're pulling from sort of the different histories and traditions. I'm curious how, when you are writing your own poem, whether that's in the drafting or in the revision, as you're thinking through the sort of like things you want to pull in, is there a point in history? I mean, I know you identify as like part of the post-revolution generation. You know, that is your upbringing. But is there a particular set of traditions you're pulling from, or like what does it mean for you when you're writing or revising to have these sort of different traditions to pull from?
Mainly who we call the classical poets, especially Nali. I always constantly reread him when I'm writing. He's very special for me. The other classics as well, the classic poets of the Kurdish poets, the same. From the international poets, I really like the classics. From Greek, for example, let's say, not really modern. I like the modern poets, let's say, but when I'm writing, I never feel myself like I'm drawing, let's say, inspiration from them.
Yeah,
honestly.
yeah.
And they say about my writing, it is modern here in Kurdistan, but the inspiration, I don't feel it myself that it comes from the really modern and contemporary ones.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a real difference between reading sort of contemporary poets who are trying to make sense of the experience you're having versus like reading, you know, I myself have been like mostly I've resolved to read mostly dead poets in the last several years, because there's something about time, right? So there's something about like poets making sense of their particular place and time that, to your point, like is like more stirring. There's something where it's like, right, like their particular cultural context is so different and specific from mine, but like the fact that they're sort of like thinking about similar things, or they bring to light different strands of similar thought because of that particular place, then allows you to sort of build on top of it. You know, it's like, it's nice to see, it's good to have your sort of contemporary experience reflected back to you. But to your point, I think there's a kind of like, if thought is a way of building on top of each other, I think it's you know, in some ways you kind of have to look at the past.
Of course, even in the classics, I really like epic poetry. I'm very interested in epic poetry. With that, alongside that, I'm really interested in philosophy. Let's say French and German philosophy from kind of after the 1960s. So all of it gets mixed up, you know. you think about, for example, 1 minute you think about Jacques Derrida, the other minute you think about Homer, the other minute you think about someone else. So it's not really easy to pinpoint.
Yeah.
For
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
sorry.
No, please.
Go ahead.
Would you be willing to read a poem in Kurdish, either a classic or your own?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Would you like write if would it? Yeah.
From who would you like? From someone else? From myself?
Let's do one of the classics, your favorites. Let's start there.
Why not? So this poem is by Nali. Since it's a bit long, I won't be reading it all.
Sure.
So شەوی بەهاری جوانی خەوێ بۆ پڕ تەشویر لە فەجری پاییزی پیری بەیانی دا تعبیر چ شەو چ ڕۆژ بەها کورتی و لەهو و لەعب و میزاح کە هەردوو وەک یەک چوون بە نەغمەی بەموزیر ئەسف درێژی شەو و ڕۆژی ئەو شەو و ڕۆژەم قوسووریان بووە توڵی نەدامەتی تەقسیر سەوادی توڕەی ئەو ئیشتیباهی سەهوی جوان بەیازی غوڕەی ئەم انتیباهی سوجدەی پیر وەکو نەهاری بەهاری درێژ و پاییزی کورد ئەمەل گەلێک و تەویل و عەمەل کەمێک و قەسیر غوباری ئەو شەو و ڕۆژەن ڕدێنی ماش و برنجی کە تێکەڵن شەبەهی سوبح و شام و شیر و قیر.
Thank you.
Anytime.
Yeah, can you tell me a little about that poem? I mean, all I have is rhythm and sound, obviously.
Okay. It's, in general, it's about getting old. He's describing the state of getting old and comparing it to being young when you're young. And it's really heavily loaded with metaphors and some small intertextualities between the Arabic language and the Quran, and it's a thing in classic poetry. Let's say they were really heavily under the influence of the Quran and the Islamic heritage. Let's say, because at the end they were mullahs, let's say, and the old education we didn't have, by the way, at that time, let's say, a normal education. Only there was religious education.
Yeah.
So I say translating that kind of imagery wouldn't be very easy like now for me, but let's say it's about getting old.
Yeah.
To unbelievably oversimplify it.
Of course. You said something that I'm curious about that I wanted to ask you. You know, there's in the Islamic world, there's this tradition of poetry, like you said, where the poets are largely mullahs, right? They're religious scholars and leaders within the community, and they're also political leaders to a certain extent. And I'm curious, sort of with that tradition as a backdrop, how poetry shows up in like contemporary politics and within contemporary political leaders, and Slemony in particular. I think if you have ideas about more broadly, but I'm really curious about like, what the relationship to poetry is for people who elected, or for officials, political leaders, community leaders. Do they use poetry to campaign? How does that show up?
Over there, just like the definition of poetry and how we see poetry, the connection between the poet and the ruler, let's say, or the politician in these days, throughout the years, it really changed. For example, the times of the classics, let's say, if we talk about Nali and Uh, the area itself was ruled by rulers who liked poetry, who read poetry, sometimes even wrote poetry. But comparing it to these days, I don't, to be honest, see a relationship between our officials and politicians and real contemporary poetry. So no, I'd say that they never use it in their campaigns, and even poets and writers, they don't write something. The real writers, let's say, they never write something that it can be politically used. So no, I wouldn't say that there's a healthy connection, let's say.
When you say that, poets and writers don't write something that can be politically used, is that like a conscious decision? Is that like a sort of
yes,
political?
Yes, it is a conscious decision, because poets and writers on one side and the politicians on the other side, we never like each other.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very conscious, in fact, and the writers in the past few years were really criticizing the let's say the political rule and the political system here.
Yeah. Can you tell me? Yeah, that's super interesting to me. So I think that's like fairly common in most places. I think you're right that like let's see, there's like the aesthetic and ethical tradition of poets to be in conflict with like the state or the empire, and I think that's good. That's a useful tension. That's an important tension. I then find myself interested in like what and how, as you see sort of elected leaders and politicians in Slemani and in the Kurdish region, sort of like how would you characterize them, their relationship to language? Because obviously they're still utilizing language, as a tool.
Yeah.
People to sort of like narrativize a particular, this particular moment in time in order to drive, a particular action that they want and build political will. Like, how would you characterize their relationship to language, and what's wrong with it? Trouble it for me.
It's that's what's wrong with it. Let's say if a poet or a writer corrected a politician's language, there wouldn't be much left of it, and you would change everything. You would change the language itself of the politician, let's say. So I wouldn't, or I'm not saying that I don't want it to be this and I want it to be that, because I would change it basically to every part and bit of it. But what's really wrong, and what's really like should not be wrong, and for their sake should not be wrong, not for the people or for me, but for their sake, is to be, every language needs to get updated, to be reborn these days, because everything changes so quickly. But when I hear their language, or when I look at their campaigns and what they say in the media, it's the same from before 50 years ago. It's the same rhetoric that's been used 50 years ago. And it's still the same now. They're not even like updating the language for their sake, for their benefits. So yeah, it's some kind of a dead language, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that's I think I think there's a discourse in, certainly I think, contemporary American poetry about or certainly the way I see it, I'm paraphrasing and simplifying, but that like I said, if the poet's role is to sort of like make language alive, right? The role of power, the role of elected officials, the role of politicians, the role of like corporations, and really any institution that is trying to consolidate power is to take that newly enlivened language and utilize it for its purposes, and thereby killing that, like making it dead, right? Making those phrases mean less. And it's and I'm super interested in that phenomenon and see how that translates across the world. Yeah, and I think there's also something about and I'm curious about also like, you know, how the internet accelerates those cycles as well. That I feel like increasingly, you know, if the faster poets come up with new ways to enliven language, the faster then the other side is able to like eat it up and spit it back out.
If I have to choose a side, I'd say the politicians are making a better use of it, a worse use of it in our terminology, but for themselves, a better use of it. And just as you said, they take it and spit it out.
Yeah.
From other countries, from leaders from other countries. But, you know, the writers, it's not on them, I'd say, because I believe still writing is in most of it, even now, is in books, not on the internet, let's say. So our main place as writers and readers are books.
Yeah.
So of course we wouldn't count so much on internet, let's say, as our main source of input. But yeah, the politicians, they count on it much more, if I have to compare in that matter, that way.
I think I'm curious then, like kind of across on the other side, you know, I'm thinking, you know, in preparation for this, I was looking at some Kurdish poets, and I came across Abdullah Pashu. You know, says a lot, I think compares the sort of like Kurdish poet to the Russian poet, especially Yevtushenko. And you know, there's a quote I see, I've seen a few times where it's like the Kurdistan poets are more than just poets. And so in that sense, there's a kind of, I'm curious about that. Like, I'm curious about like how that resonates with you and what that means in terms of, okay, so you're in this place where poets now have the ability to sort of write beyond, you know, it's not just inherently revolutionary. There's a space to breathe, you know, where we started the conversation. But there's also, I think, implied in that quote, and maybe that is a point in time quote, is that like there is a kind of leadership role that poets sort of take, at least in relationship to language. Yeah, I'm curious if that tracks for you, or how that resonates.
Leadership in terms of language, I'd say every poet should have that role in every language. In terms of, let's say, social leadership, and for the time of revolutions in our areas, that happened because poetry played a major role in the revolutions and the uprisings. But after that, in the contemporary era, I'd say just like any poet from any other country, you lead in language. Let's say that's basically part of your job, let's say. But in general, in terms of like from the times of Abdullah Pashu compared to now, no.
Yeah.
I mean, socially and politically, to lead socially and politically, or in those spheres.
Yeah. And do you feel that kind of like social political leadership for poets is sort of directly tied or inherent to the sort of social political context where, you know, what Kurdish people needed at that time was revolution, and therefore the task of the poet was to be a revolutionary. And now you see that a little differently because the social political context is different? Or I guess I'm curious, what Yeah, is the context
the context is different, and the nature of what we call poetry and a poet today compared to then is different, basically.
Yeah.
For example, even in America, for example, what, let's say, Allen Ginsberg did back in the days, I don't think that he would do it if he was alive now in the same way. But still, he is Allen Ginsberg, let's say.
Yeah.
As an example.
Can you tell me more what you mean? Like he couldn't pull off like the stuff that he was saying then is like not as.
I didn't mean that he couldn't pull it off.
Sure.
But going on the streets and asking for or having demands outside. I put it like having demands outside the paper or outside writing on the streets.
Yeah.
That's when you take a look at that. We have so many poets here that participated in the revolution, let's say, back in the days. But now when I talk with them, I ask them, would you do it again these days? They say no. And I say why. I ask them why. And they say, they start counting how many things have changed, how much things have changed, even the parties, the ruling regime, and so on. And on the other side, even their perspective to poetry have changed as well.
Yeah. And I think now you're getting at something I'm also really interested in, too, the way that, and it sounds like there's actually sort of an inherent, at least in the way you're characterizing it, there's kind of poets know that writing the poem is not the same as the act, right? To bring up the famous Auden quote, which I'm going to ask you to read in a little bit, right? Like poetry makes nothing happen, right? Like the poems themselves are not actions, right? But for the poem to be like revolutionary, they have to be met with like a revolutionary action, right? Or even for the poem to be political, right? Like after the poem is read, like you must do something. And the thing that gets done after that is what makes the poet or the poem, dangerous to a sense of power. Does that feel true? Where it's like people know that like there's writing poems and then there's like doing stuff in the world. I bring that up because I think I have a critique of some contemporary American poetry where I think there's a lot of poets who view the writing of the poem as inherently revolutionary, and I'm like, no, but then you have to go do stuff after that. Like being a revolutionary, writing. Course it is going to organize your people, right? Like knowing who your neighbors are and looking out for one another is much more revolutionary than writing a beautiful turn of phrase.
For me, I think it's a choice, some kind of a choice, and I choose to write about revolution. I choose to go and do or participate in the revolution. These are different things, let's say. And if I write about revolution and I come to you and I tell you that I'm a revolt, that doesn't work like that. I don't believe in that as well. We are on the same page, I think.
Yeah.
So you choose to do both. You choose to only write about it. You choose to not write about it or participate in it only. I think there's so much written about this from the lefts, from the like nearly from the times of Soviet up until now. The thinkers and writers write about it, but I like those writings. I get back to them from time to time, but overall and at the end of the day, I see it as simple as either you participate or you don't. Either you write about it or you write in that direction or you don't.
Yeah.
So it's about the choice. But what is behind the choice and what consciousness is behind that choice, that's the important part, I think.
Yeah. I think that's a good place as any. I think we're going to wrap up the conversation with a reading of the In Memory of W.B. Yeats by W.H. Auden. Would you mind?
Of course, sure. But should I read it all?
Yeah, I don't think why not. It's a little longer. Yeah. We obviously have to get to at least the second part, and then at that point, it's like we might as well finish it.
How about only reading the third part? My favorite part.
Sure. Yeah. If you have, please.
Yalla. Okay, should I start?
Please.
Earth, receive an honored guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie, locked and frozen in each eye. Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the present of his days, teach the free man how to praise.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Zamwa.
Thank you.
That's what I've got.
Thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, today I went and read some of your poems. What's available online, let's say?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
There's one, it's called On Desire.
Yeah.
Yeah, it caught my attention. I was really interested about it.
Thank you.
So, and I noticed that you have a connection with the, let's say, God.
Yeah.
In the texts.
Yeah.
Care to elaborate about that?
Yeah.
In any way that you're comfortable?
Yeah, of course. Let's see. I grew up Muslim and Catholic. So my dad is from Jordan and my mom is Philippines. And so there was a period of my life where I went to Jummah on Friday and then went to Mass on Sundays. My parents were really actually, they came from such different parts of the world and grew up in really different cultural contexts. But I think one of the things that they were really in lockstep about was this notion that all the sort of, the three great monotheistic religions are sort of chapters of the same book. Even beyond that, I think, that was like the sort of kitchen table conversation. But I think for me, what I took away in my adult life is the way that ritual and form and structure, like just like a daily structure, right? I think like Salat is like, to me, less about the actual conversation with God or even just like what your own individual imagination of God is, which obviously is like limited, right? Like you just can't actually imagine God. Like that's the very nature of God. But the practice of it, the dailiness of it, and maybe it's not daily, for different people, but I think the structure of one's life invites communion. I really love the idea of communion, the idea that like, they're very, very different ways, different words to use, but the sense that like you are part of something bigger, and I think the question of whether it's intelligent design or like accident is almost secondary. It's rather like, how do you open yourself up to the possibility of that of the sublime, right? Kant's sublime even. And I think for me that is largely like observing it really closely in mass every Sunday and at Jummah on Fridays, that like the key for me towards that is to give oneself over to a sort of like, to fall into a kind of repetitive ritual as a way to access what I would consider to be like a very spiritual, I'm not sure that I consider myself a very religious person like right now, like I don't go to mosque, I don't go to church all that frequently, but I do think of myself as like a very spiritual in the sense of like I want to structure my life in a way that allows me to find that. Yeah,
I see.
Yeah. What is it? Can I ask what's your relationship to, God and the divine?
I think for a writer, everything's are words.
Yeah, totally.
Including that.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, I really think about it. I really like to read in, let's say, religious studies, philology. I majored in sociology, and
so yeah,
a major part of it is the sociology of religion, and so on. I'm really interested in it, but spiritually, let's say, for myself, I'm not, let's say, very drawn into the idea of a, let's say, ultimate higher being.
Sure. Yeah.
But I'm interested in like scripture, very interested. I read the Old and New Testament. I read the Quran.
Yeah.
So yeah, they are amazing texts, great texts, let's say, very, very interesting.
Yeah.
But let's say, as an act of belief and as an act of being religiously committed to, here we have Salah instead of church. So doing that, no, I don't think I'm very committed to that.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, I get it. I mean, I'm also, I think for me, my interest in, let's see, that's my personal interest in spirituality. I think the sort of like poems as a way to, interact in the public or to like put things into the culture. I do think there's kind of, at least in our cultural context, I think, there's such an extreme secularism.
And on the contrary, we have extreme, let's say, Islamism.
Yeah.
And your output and your, let's say, the writer's social responsibility is like to answer for that in ways or others. For example, so in writing, like not only me, the whole generation is like trying to neutralize some concepts and some notions that are like for every modern human, but the extremists and this extremist atmosphere doesn't allow it here in Iraq, let's say.
Yeah.
So we have that responsibility, I'd say.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm there's I love I think you're putting your finger right on the thing that I'm thinking about, which is that like I think how do we interact with like spiritual texts, or how do we bring them into our daily life in a way that allows us like multiple experiences, right? I think that's the thing, right? There's sort of like this extreme secularism here, and even the extreme Islamism there are sort of all driving towards the same thing, right? It's all driving towards like a singular interpretation, right? I think like about like the power of this, and ultimately like at the far end, fascism is like there's only a single narrative and everyone has to sort of snap to it, right? Everyone's behaviors has to like change to align to that narrative. So how do we then, like, for me, I'm interested in, again, because of my social context, like how do I bring in some of these like older texts that remind us that like we are not actually hovering above history, right? We're not just like out of time and place finding ourselves in this like single narrative, but rather like, yeah, there are many things happening all of the time, which I think, again, like it's a very different context, but it feels like very to your social project too.
I agree.
Cool. Well, thank you again so much, Zamwa. This was really lovely.
Thank you. It was great. It was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This has been an amazing conversation. If you're interested in finding out more about Zamwa and Dujie's work, you can check out the links to their books and their websites in the show description below. Thank you so much to our partners at Slemony UNESCO City of Literature. We're also grateful to Seattle's Office of Arts and Culture for their support of this program. And of course, thanks to all of you watching. We'll see you next time.